Welcome to Sunday Mornings at the Marxist Library. A quick note before we start, this session is being recorded and will be posted on YouTube with the link on our website, ICSS-NPML within the next few days. And again, welcome everyone, Sunday mornings. For close to a decade and a half, our sessions were held at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library located in Oakland, California. We're now hosting our sessions on Zoom and have speakers and attendees from throughout the United States and throughout the world. My name is Alan Miller, and I will be hosting this meeting. I'm a member of the program committee that organizes Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library, and I would like to start off by saying that we always welcome input, suggestions for topics, feedback, and suggestions for speakers. You can contact us through our website at ICSS-NPML. Before we start, we wish to remind everyone that this is a comradely forum for political discourse and debate. As such, we ask that you show respect for our participants and the moderator of today's session. Also, please note that the opinions expressed are those of the speaker and participants. They do not necessarily represent those of the ICSS or the Marxist Library. However, we are united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe that his work remains relevant today. Our motto is taken from Marx's 11th thesis on Feuerbach, quote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it." We have a very important and serious session today, criminalizing Palestinian solidarity. Many of you have heard about in response to demonstrations, solidarity demonstrations throughout the world, governments are arresting activists, suppressing dissent, suppressing all criticism of Zionism and the genocidal war on Palestine. Here in the Bay Area, we have the Oakland and San Francisco school districts are under investigation by the federal government, possibly for civil rights violations, in response to teach-ins that were held by the members of the teachers union. One of the most significant cases that's come up, an international case, on November 25th, 3 members of the Communist Party, Great Britain, Marxist-Leninists, were arrested at a national Palestinian solidarity demonstration for manning a table, selling a book critical of the history of Zionism that was published 9 years ago and has since been distributed widely. While imprisoned, their families were subjected to 3 a.m. raids, during which police seized phones, laptops, and party literature. Then, on the 13th of January, another huge London demonstration with solidarity of Palestine was targeted, this time not in a hunt for anti-Semites, quote unquote, but for, quote, terrorist sympathizers. Some 50 police officers descended on CPGB-ML supporters, surrounding them, confiscating their literature. A leaflet that was seized had been distributed at every Palestine demonstration since October. 3 supporters were arrested. The justification for their arrest was that the leaflet supported Hamas, a banned organization in breach of the 2000 UK Terrorism Act. Our speaker today is Ranjeet Brar, one of those who was arrested at the November 25th rally. He's a pro-Palestine, anti-Zionist activist, journalist, author, and member of the Communist Party of Great Britain. Dr. Brar is also a vascular surgeon at the University of Sheffield, Royal College of Surgeons of England in the United Kingdom. And we want to welcome you this morning, Dr. Brar. We're very, very concerned and interested to hear about your case. So why don't you go ahead and take it away? Whoop, you're muted, Ranjeet.
Thank you, Alan. So, Alan, all of you, thank you very much for inviting me. Pleasure to be with you. We grow up in Britain knowing a great deal about American culture, and as a revolutionary, I think a lot about American revolutionary culture. So the Bay Area is known to me as a home of dockers, as a home of militant working class activity, as an area hotbed of the activity formerly of the Communist Party when the Communist Party was strong in America and the Communist movement was strong, and of course as the place where I think of the Black Panther Party and then having its kind of key area of germination really from where it spread. So we've got a strong history, and we still read about actions periodically of the dockers when they refuse to go along with some aspect of imperial policy and are capable of making themselves felt as organized workers still. So it's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you for your introduction. I guess I'll start just by kind of going over those details so that you understand and that they're broadly right. I've got a picture of the book here, and this is the book for which I was initially arrested. This book is called Zionism. And as you see, it's subtitled A Racist, Anti-Semitic and Reactionary Tool of Imperialism. And there are several pictures on the book. We've had to modify the front cover because on my bail conditions, they said that this was what they objected to, the juxtaposition of Nazism, of the symbol of Nazism with a symbol of Israel. And this, of course, goes contrary to something that we're familiar with in our country, and you probably are familiar in your country, the so-called IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association. I don't know to what extent that is pushed in the United States, as pushed very heavily in my country and in Europe. And interestingly, that organization popped out of the ether perhaps 5 years ago as an instrument to beat Corbyn in our country with a relatively left-wing leader of the Labour Party that our state was very keen to remove. Prior to that, the very same definition of anti-Semitism, and I won't go into in too much detail, was put forward by the Economic Committee of the EU. So this was something that's been put forward by bankers in the first instance in the European Union, and has been adopted in order to basically conflate anti-Zionism, criticism of Zionism, criticism of the state of Israel, criticism of its very real crimes, which now have gone all the way, apparently, to the highest international tribunal in the world, the International Court of Justice, which has indeed ruled that Israel is intentionally perpetrating genocide, ethnic cleansing against the Palestinian people. And of course, that brought a wave of activity around the world, and a wave of activity to our streets. And some of those demonstrations I've participated in. And you're right, as a communist, I've participated in demonstrations and social movements around organized labor really my whole life. And this party, the Communist Party of Great Britain, Marxist-Leninist, which you can probably read there, and you can find our stuff online, has been giving out these little leaflets about things of interest. The problem is capitalism, the solution is socialism, very brief analysis, simple to digest, places where you can make contact with us. This is standard activity of the working class movement that you will recognize from many different organizations who participate in the working class movement. And we've used to existing in a space, however much we have a revolutionary take on life, and we understand fundamentally the state as it currently exists is not a democracy. It serves a bourgeoisie, it serves the ruling class, it serves the moneyed interest, it serves a corporate elite. There are many words for it. What Lenin thought of as analysis of imperialism, of monopoly capitalists who dominate our domestic economy and use that to dominate the globe. Despite that, because we've lived in the heartland of imperialism, yourselves in the United States, myself in Britain, there's been a kind of cozy democratic space on which you can make even these revolutionary criticisms. And because our governments have felt very confident in their rule and power, they have allowed that to carry on. And the way that they've controlled it has been through controlled opposition. In your country, perhaps having two parties, Democrats and Republicans, that Democrats traditionally thought of as being a working class party. People are discarding that notion. But in my country, we had the Labour Party, of course. And this is one of the books. We have a lot of literature, a lot of information. This book is called Social Democracy, The Enemy Within. That's by my father, Ranjeet Brar. The picture on the front is from our great miners' strike of 1984, which was one of the titanic struggles of labor, which the working class lost in our country, but which showed the brutality of the state towards workers, and in this case, a journalist, of the police beating down journalists. And this explains the history of the Labour Party and how that controlled opposition existed. But that controlled opposition was the way in which the political narrative and organized labor is controlled, and with the complicity actually of the trade union movement and organized labor. And because they felt very confident in their rule, we've been allowed to operate, and we've not been used to this level of state repression. And I think what's different with the Palestine movement is that at this moment, our government, our state, our ruling class actually feels very weak. And they're weakened by a number of factors. There's a global economic crisis, which is economically challenging them. And that means there's unprecedented levels of poverty, at least in my lifetime. Poverty that they haven't seen perhaps since the 30s and 40s, since pre-World War Britain. So that in my country, which is a small country compared to yours, it probably has 67 million population. Around 15 million working people are living in poverty. Their children are hungry. They're not being able to feed and clothe themselves adequately. They are insecure. They're insecure in their housing. So there's a large groundswell of people who are poor. And then that middle class section, the comfortable middle class that allowed everything to be moderate, nothing to get out of hand, people living a good life and therefore didn't put up too much political opposition, are also being pushed down by an inflationary crisis consequent upon the 2008 banking collapse and the printing of money ever since, but exacerbated, of course, by the war that's being fought by my country and your country, by the NATO countries against Russia in Ukraine. So a proxy war in which energy supplies to Europe have been torpedoed. We didn't realize the extent to which perhaps Europe was dependent and the global energy market was dependent for its prices and its relatively cheap fuel on Russia. And having sanctioned Russia, that had enormous effects on Europe, the European energy market. And even though Britain has a relatively small percentage of its fuel comes from Russia, because it's affected the whole market, it's had a far bigger impact on our cost of living, on cost of fuel, cost of manufacturers. Prices in the shops have doubled over a period of a few years. So there's a real inflationary crisis, cost of living crisis, poverty crisis in our country, which means that actually people are turning away from Labour, turning away from Tories, turning away from the mainstream political discourse. And they're in a point where they're anyway looking for other solutions. Now, when the Ukraine war happened, my fellow countrymen, working people in my country, swallowed the narrative, the NATO narrative, that this was about Russian imperialism invading Ukraine. They swallowed that quite easily. And it was a plethora of, Ukrainian flags appeared all over the place. We were being asked to donate to Ukraine, to give money to Ukraine, to aid the war in Ukraine. Even in my hospital, emails went around essentially raising money for something called Flowers for Ukraine. They're very innocuous sounding names, but when we drilled down what they were getting at, they were actually raising money to send military equipment to Ukraine from workers, even in the hospital. So there's a very strong support, and that's faded as that war clearly is having, one, losing, and two, having negative impact on the workers of Europe. But then into that milieu, came a renewal of struggle of the Palestinian people. And the struggle of the Palestinian people, I don't need to tell you, I'm sure, is not a new struggle. And Britain has a particular role and a particular responsibility, having been essentially the creator of the state of Israel in Palestine. And this really is the knowledge that's contained in this book, the history of how it was not a Jewish idea that created Israel. It was a British imperialist idea that created Israel. That Zionism was a British ideology pushed by, yes, Balfour and the Balfour Declaration, but other powerful members of the essentially Victorian ruling class who had their own Christian fundamentalist beliefs, but also, one, were deeply anti-Semitic themselves and looking for reasons to take Jews out of Europe, and two, wanted a way to, one, seize territories from Ottoman Empire, and then after the Second World War, when it came to really having the mandate for Palestine, having Iraq, having Iran fall into their hands, it was a question of how to rule them. And as oil was discovered there, and it became increasingly strategic important, that question became, again, central to the way in which the wealth of my country, and later your country, was secured. So the looting of the Middle East is central to the economic health of Anglo-American imperialism, as we call it. Because although your nation, although America has the dominant military force, or had the dominant military force, I think that balance of power is also changing with the rise of BRICS, the rise of Russia and China, the relative decline of the US. All of these things are changing, which is why our ruling class are in such a frenzy. While your country had the balance of military power, There was an alliance of capital. Britain, as an old colonial power that had enormous banks and looted enormous wealth for hundreds of years from whole swathes of the globe, including India, where my ancestors come from, and Africa, Asia, Latin America, all over the world. If you look at a map where of the countries Britain hasn't invaded, you find that there's about 9 countries in the world that Britain hasn't at some stage invaded. So that imperial history, looting the globe, concentration of wealth in our country, and then the enormous banking wealth that's created is an ongoing feature of our current economic policy, how to protect investments, protect the flow of revenue from export of capital. So, for those reasons, this knowledge of where Zionism came from isn't just a criticism of the current genocide we're seeing playing out in Israel. It goes to the heart of a criticism of the real financial economic interests of our ruling class, which is why our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, our leader of the opposition, Keir Starmer, and, Uncle Tom Cobley, and really every MP in our House of Commons, pretty much, with few honorable exceptions, basically support Israel's genocide, despite the problems that that's causing. And as we see it igniting a war in the Middle, wider war in the Middle East, you see our countries, America and Britain, just engaging in strike after every country in the Middle East who stands against them and is starting to stand up. And Palestine has been a trigger for that, but it's an old conflict, an old hot history. But our essential analysis is that Israel is not the only democracy of the Middle East, as we are told and constantly fed, but it is essentially a settler colonial state, an apartheid state. And that is why it has fundamentally racist beliefs, as we can see. That's why it has essentially treated the Palestinian people as subhuman and not worthy of having the same rights. And it's why it feels comfortable with itself as it's committing this most atrocious genocide. So my personal history is that I've been a political activist. While I've been a political activist, I've become a doctor. While I've been a politicalist, I've trained as a surgeon. While I've been a political activist, I have become a consultant surgeon, and I love what I do, and I love treating people, and I love looking after them. But I'm deeply aware of the problems there are in the world that go beyond my individual skill and my individual responsibility to my patients. That we need to create a world that itself is peaceful, and yet we live in a world where all around us is war. So I find no contradiction between my position as a doctor, trying to help individual patients, and my position as a political activist, trying to address the very major problems in the world that we're encouraged in our countries to turn away from, turn the other cheek, look the other way from, explain away, say they're complex problems that don't concern us, don't get involved. And what we're seeing now is that because they cut to the heart of the real economic interests of our ruling class, we are not being forgiven in telling the truth. The truth itself has become dangerous. As Goebbels used to say, the Nazi propaganda minister, the truth is the enemy of the lie. And of course, if the lie is the narratives of the state, then by extension, the truth is the enemy of the state. And it's really for telling the truth that we're being victimized. So this is a fantastic booklet. It is available on our website, thecommunists.org. So www.thecommunists.org. It's very succinct. It tells the history of Zionism, of how the British aimed to Judaize Zionism and Zionize Judaism. And once they'd created that force, particularly through the help of Leo Pinsker and, of course, Theodore Herzl, they were able to then create the settler colonial state, expand it, and use it as a base of power in their new colonies. It also tells the story, hence the front cover reference, of how, because it was a far-right ideology from its outset, because it wanted to encourage separation, not integration, it didn't thank the progressive, it was a minority viewpoint, which was prepared to bargain away the majority's interests for its own political interests. And therefore, when Nazis came to power in Germany, it actually made a direct deal with them, the transfer agreement, the Havara, which was a transfer agreement of money and people. So it became a banking house that facilitated the transfer of capital from Germany to Palestine. And so that became deeply embarrassing, of course, to Israel after the war, particularly the conduct of the Hungarian and German Zionist organizations and their collaboration with Nazism, even up to the point of collaboration in rounding up Hungarian Jewry, who were not amenable to Zionism and were very progressive, and encouraging them to board trains, which ultimately took them to their deaths in Nazi concentration camps. So this is the history of Zionism. And when you know that history, it blows away the myth that you can't criticize Israel because Israel as is the homeland of the Jews. It's not the homeland of the Jews. The Jews belong all over the world to all the many different cultures they're from. Judaism is a religion. It is a colonial project aimed at the suppression of the Palestinian people and the Arab people. And that's why it is able to commit these crimes. And that's why it's allowed to. So that's the background of the book. I, in particular, went down on this day on the 25th to have a demonstration in a stall. And it's a big demonstration. Some of the demonstrations have been literally a million strong. Probably on that day, it was a couple of weeks after, the 11th of November, when we had that very largest demonstration. And it was perhaps 500,000 to 750,000. Very large demonstration. We had a quite innocent stall with a lot of books. I mean, we have a lot of books, So we have books on the Corbyn project. We have books on immigration and its relation to capitalism. We have Manifesto for the Crisis explaining to workers what they need to do to survive. We have books exposing the nature and history of the Labour Party. We have a huge amount of literature. But what we have right now is a very large movement who are hungry for knowledge. And I've never known a situation when it's been so easy to approach workers in the street, particularly around Palestine and these huge demonstrations, who want to know. They see the crimes, but they want to connect it. They want to know, how did this come about? Why is it our politicians don't do something about it? Their eyes are opening. They're realizing that the lies they're told are not true, and they're really ready to accept historical truth and knowledge. And it's for this reason, I think, that we've been singled out. It became apparent to us that Zionist organizations were working in close collaboration with the police on the streets of London. We have one called Harry's Place, at Hurry Up Harry. It is on the internet, but there are others, campaign against anti-Semitism. And of course, there are large Israel lobby groups which work with the Labour and Tory parties, our two largest parties. So Friends of Israel, Labour Friends of Israel, Conservative Friends of Israel, they work at the highest level with politicians. So the lobby itself has spotters on the street who they use to pick out people they want targeted. And they picked this out initially, and they initially said this was punishable under Section 5 and Section 18 later of the Public Order Act. Now, Public Order Act in our country just means, what it literally means is threatening words and behavior. So police came to me. Initially, they were fine, went away. Then they were told, after the spotters had seen the book, oh, no, we have to arrest. No. First of all, they had to confiscate the book. So they took about 20 of the books away, took our details, and said it's threatening words and behavior, but it's racially aggravated. So it's racist. It's racist to tell the history of Zionism, to expose Zionism. So using that conflation. So it's not us that conflate Zionism and Judaism, but in fact, it's the Zionists themselves that encourage the conflation of Judaism and Zionism in order to protect what really is a criminal enterprise. Particularly if you see it in the light of its current crimes and the ICJ judgments against it. Our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and at the time our Home Secretary, now gone, Suella Braverman, put very heavy pressure on the police to criminalize the demonstrations. He said these are hate marches. The police must be tougher on them. You're giving lenient policing, you're giving unfair policing, you must crack down on them. And it was in light of this that they'd opened up special police stations, that they anticipate making large arrests. They used Zionist spotters, and they manufactured, they looked for excuses. And this was the excuse they found, this particular pamphlet, on the first occasion. They took 4 of us initially, as they arrested us. So initially they confiscated the book. Half an hour later, they came back and said, oh, now we've been told we have to arrest you. And they literally cuffed us behind our backs and dragged us away, even though we were standing peacefully on the street at a stall, having conversations with people and had done nothing wrong. And they're selling a book that, as you say, is an old book, which tells an old story, which is only full of historical facts. And if you look at the other pictures around it, they actually tell some of the stories of the crimes committed by Israel, of the T-shirts, worn by IDF soldiers, which glorify the killing of pregnant women. So there's a picture of a pregnant woman in the sights of a sniper scope with the slogan, 1 shot, 2 kills. It's okay to kill pregnant women. It's okay to kill babies in the womb, because what you're doing is you're killing 2 Arabs who are just going to grow up, basically one terrorist, one person who's going to grow up to become a terrorist. And you can see these kind of memes, produced over and over again. And you can see them now right up to the level of the Israeli cabinet when they're saying, when Smotrich or Netanyahu are saying that they're literally going to wipe out the Palestinians, when their defense minister is saying we're going to cut off food, water, electricity, fuel, medical supplies. We're dealing with human animals. So this is very clearly documented, and this has gotten very, very, very. This understanding has reached around the world. So they came back for us, then arrested us, took us and held us for 24 hours. And ultimately, they sent people to interview us who knew very little about the history. And by the time they'd finished speaking to us, I don't think they had much to say. They were essentially, they bailed us on further investigation. We have to represent to the police station. I imagine that they will have to drop all charges because there's no charge to answer unless you say the historical truth itself is a crime. And it's a very dangerous precedent for them to really go down the road of having that as a court case. So that was that. They left us with bail conditions. My bail conditions were not to give out any leaflet, or any pamphlet, any book of any kind on the street during a demonstration. So can't any longer give knowledge to people on demonstrations. If I went to a demonstration, not to deviate from the line of the demonstration, and if I went there, not to have far right symbols. So this, of course, they're saying, oh, this is a far right symbol. Of course, it's not my symbol. It's pointing out the symbols of others. And actually, it's an anti-racist book that's calling out and condemning racism. So that was that. But they did say I could go to demonstrations. And so, again, in January, as the genocide is continuing, I went with another group of comrades to have a stall. But this time, I didn't go to the stall. I went with a loudspeaker and simply spoke. And again, there are videos of me speaking to the crowd. It was soon after the South Africans had brought the case to the ICJ, having a dialogue with the crowd, getting chants going. It was a nice occasion. And then I left. And after I'd left, my comrades who had been running a stall nearby, but which I hadn't been doing, they were arrested. This time, Section 12 of the Terrorism Act. This was a leaflet which they said, when it said victory to the Palestinian resistance, that this was calling for victory for Hamas, and therefore was calling for support of an outlawed organization. And that's more sinister because it can take a prison sentence in my country of up to 14 years in prison. Now, I said I haven't done any such thing, but of course, it's not my job to tell the Palestinians who their leadership should and shouldn't be, but the right of the Palestinians as an occupied people to resist is enshrined in international law. And if you go back to 1960s, 1971, there are two very prominent resolutions which list the Palestinian people together with the South African people as having the right to resist apartheid by any means necessary, including armed struggle. So this is clearly international law. And so again, they haven't got a leg to stand on. One, because I didn't give out any leaflet, because I was a bail condition saying I couldn't. Two, they can, even if you said I was responsible for the leaflet via my organization, doesn't call for support for any prescribed organization. Three, then calling for resistance and the right to exist and therefore resist for an occupied people is legal and just. So on every count, they had a very weak case. And again, took me in. They didn't take me in, they took my comrades in. They took three of them into a police station, Hammersmith police station. And the next day when they were due to be released, we went to the station and we were going to welcome them out. We held a small action of our support for our comrades, support for Palestine. And again, Zionist spotters were used at that demonstration and the following day at the police station. And so the police inside the station came out and arrested me while I was outside the police station waiting for them to release my comrades. And they sent about 10 police out. It took me by surprise, left my son, my 4-year-old boy I was with, roaming the streets. Luckily, my friends realized and looked after him, but I was very worried about that. Took me inside. When I told them I was worried about my son, they actually then set in process this motion of kind of safeguarding and social services. So they essentially referred my son ultimately to social services and said he's a child who needs special care and attention, needs to be looked after, needs intervention from the state because I'm taking him to an unsafe place, namely a demonstration. And any child who goes to a demonstration should be reported to social services. This is their contention. So they're weaponizing the state, and apparently even its protective arm against political activists. And of course, the state against us as political activists. So when they interviewed me this time, it was anti-terrorist SO19 police who interviewed me. And again, they had no leg to stand on. They played me a little bit of transcript of my speech that I'd given out. There was nothing wrong with it. They showed me the leaflet. I explained to them I hadn't touched any leaflet, and they hadn't got any proof that I touched the leaflet because I hadn't touched the leaflet. And so I hadn't breached my bail conditions. But we had a discussion anyway on advice with my lawyer, pointing out to them the things I pointed out to you. I hadn't broken any law and that they didn't have a leg to stand on. By the end of this, they were very polite, very nice, shook my hand, said how wonderful it was to meet me. Sorry under these circumstances, let me go again. But then they've done a few things since then which are more sinister. One was the referral of my child to social services. Then they've referred me to the General Medical Council because I've been arrested. And because I work in a position of trust, the very fact of my arrest is notifiable. It's optional. They don't have to, but they can. So they have. And then equally, the letter says to the GMC, it's optional. You don't have to do anything, but you can. So the hospital then reach out to your place of work and try to cause you problems at your place of work. And of course, that threatens your registration, job, profession, which, it's not like the Palestinians suffering death and destruction and genocide, but it shows you the extent to which our states work in concert and are not prepared to tolerate the exposure of their own crimes, their complicity in those own crimes, and the extent to which they are willing to weaponize the state, first of all, in minor ways, but it's a sign of escalation, feeling out around the outsides of the movement. How can we criminalize it? How can we shut it down? So it's not, I don't think it's aimed just at me specifically, though I do think, they're particularly worried about the kind of information we're able to give. There's a huge amount of information. It's basically an alternative working class history that our organization has to offer. That was imperialism in the Middle East. We have a long history of explaining imperialism, its crimes, the way in which our working class are held in suppression. All of these things are a target. And I think in the time that we're coming to, we're going to see an escalation of the state against independent working class politics and activity, and controlled opposition again being pushed heavily in our movement. So I think there are reasons why we've been targeted, but more especially at a time when, to protect their economic interests, our government is having to escalate its war. Not only support an obvious genocide and ostracize itself from the entire world community, with more than 150 nations voting for a ceasefire and then vetoing it, with the International Court of Justice, the highest court of the United Nations, basically it's telling them a genocide is happening, an intentional genocide, and still America and Britain and the EU standing out and supporting that genocide, shielding it. They're showing themselves to be the agent of misfortune and crime, not these other. They always like to pretend they stand, in a lofty position of moral authority, judging others, and it's others who don't get along. But increasingly that lie is exposed, and it's exposed even to lay people. That essentially to your average worker on the street, it's our governments that are responsible for the crimes, just as they fought a war in Iraq. Now they're fighting, in Palestine, and they're doing so to suppress the Arab population and to be able to keep on looting, occupy Syria, occupy Iraq, keep Yemen, keep Lebanon, keep Palestine, keep Iran down, keep the independent political will of this entire region down, and to keep looting its resources. I think those are the reasons. That is kind of outlines my case. It's not the most repressive case you'll see. It pales into insignificance compared to the real heroism and self-sacrifice of the poor all over the world and people engaged in struggle all over the world. But it does show in our own countries, in the heartland of imperialism, really the reasons why they came. And I don't know how much you followed it, but when we had this leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, and they basically did the same thing. They said he's an anti-Semite for his support of Palestine. That really what Marx said. So it's a Marxist study class, and you'll be aware from, I think, the preface of Capital, Marx said nowadays atheism itself is culpa levis. It's a minor sin. And the established church, the English church, would more readily pardon an attack on 38 out of its 39 articles of faith than it would pardon an attack on 1/39 of its income. Capital, at the end of the day, needs to expand. It needs to be free to nestle everywhere, settle everywhere, penetrate everywhere. The free penetration of these huge concentrations of capital in the banks of Britain and America is an unquestionable a right of the capitalist. All other rights pale into insignificance, and it's those that they seek to protect. And it's for that reason that at a time when they're expanding this war in the Middle East, when they have literally hundreds of thousands and millions of people on the streets of London who see through their narrative, who will hold up placards saying, "Thank you, Yemen," who will oppose their imperialist policy at every step, when they realize that actually, if they were ever to precipitate this war with Russia that they're coming close to, they haven't got an army to fight it with. They might have to introduce conscription. They're afraid of introducing conscription, and yet they don't have an army that they can project their power around the world with. So our ruling class is in a deep crisis. They don't know what to do. They're in a state where they're reaching around for solutions to their problems and finding more and more fires are growing, more and more conflicts are growing, each one of which around the world they're unable to cope with. And they do have the tools to be very repressive at home. They've not traditionally done it, but they're starting to escalate social repression at home. And we've experienced a taste of that. Our work will continue. In a way, again, it's backfired because as I'm here speaking to you, and I don't know whether we would have happily come into contact, Alan, Raj, if they hadn't reached out this oppression. In the same way, people, if workers from our own country are reaching out to us, our organization is growing, and our influence and our knowledge and our networking is growing, and the movement, the anti-imperialist movement, the Marxist movement, the socialist movement, the communist movement around the world is growing in many ways as the people grow stronger, as the grip of our ruling class grows weaker. I'm convinced that despite the temporary, suffering, hardship, setbacks that we're experiencing, our movement is in a place of strength that it's not seen for, well, certainly in my lifetime. So thank you very much for having me. I hope that kind of helped you to outline my case, what happened to me, and how that fits in with our understanding of the broader conflict that's happening in the Middle East.
Thank you, Ranjeet. We're going to take a short break for announcements, but before we do, I just want to remind everybody that we're going to have question and answer following the announcements. So if you go down to the reactions button on your Zoom window, you can raise your hand and we'll try to get everybody in to ask your questions and make your comments to Ranjeet. In the meantime, let's go over a few things that are coming up for us. We have some especially important and valuable programs coming up over the next few weeks, next few Sunday mornings. Next week, we have Harpal Brar from the Communist Party of Great Britain, who will be speaking on his book, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. And I have to say that if you're interested, and you should be, about what's going on in China today, if you want to really get a substantial analysis of everything from the Cultural Revolution to the reform movement to what's going on in the Chinese economy and society today, what's going on internationally with China, this is going to be one of the best programs that you can attend to find out about what's happening in China. So that's next Sunday, 10:30 a.m. Pacific time, Harpal Brar, Socialism with Chinese Characteristics. The following Sunday, on the 18th, we have a very interesting and unusual program. A Ukrainian Marxist speaks out against Kiev's regime and NATO on the second anniversary of the special military operation. Let me read you the description of this program. 2 years of Slava Ukraine from every corner, 2 years of unprovoked invasion lies, 2 years of Russia is losing. We have seen it all unfolding in front of our eyes. But what exactly happened in February 2022? Was it really necessary to start the special military operation? And why is a Ukrainian Marxist on the side of Russia? Our speaker is Slava Jalil, a Ukrainian Marxist-Leninist, who is, by the way, from Western Ukraine. She's going to be speaking with a very on-the-ground perspective about what's going on there. She's a correspondent at the Revolution Report and a member of the Chicago Workers' School. Following that, we have on the 25th, South Africa's genocide case at the ICJ. Our speaker is Andrew Feinstein. He is a London-based activist, journalist. He's the author of Shadow World, about the arms trade in the world today, and a very eloquent speaker about, he's from South Africa and was involved in the anti-apartheid struggle as part of the ANC. He's going to be giving us a very informative description of the similarities and the differences between South African apartheid and Israeli Zionist apartheid. So one of the best speakers on the subject that we've heard. So we want to tell everybody, if you want to attend our sessions, one of the ways that you can do this is go to our website at ICSS-Marx.org. That's ICSS-Marx.org. a small pop-up will come up. Put your name, your email address in there, and you'll receive notices for each of our programs with a link to attend. Also, we have past programs. We have links to them, descriptions, and links to videos. Going back quite a ways, I think about 10 years, we have videos. So do go to our website. If you wish to contact us, you can go to the contact form on our website and send us a note if you have suggestions for speakers. We have some other really great programs in the works. We don't even have time to go into all of them, but we urge you to go to our website and sign up to get on our list. So with that, what we're going to do is we're going to shift over to the question and answer part of our program. And I'm going to start. It's funny, I'm not sure why my hand is up, but I'm going to start with
the co-hosts share it. That's why your name comes up.
Okay. Okay. Well, I do have questions.
I thought you raised the hand. I'm sorry, that's me doing it. It appeared as Raj Sahai, but it's perhaps Mehmet doing it, or I don't know who.
Okay.
Yes,
Well,
I raised the hand, but that's because we are co-hosts. That's why
Okay.
it shows your name.
I'll change
Okay.
to your name, okay?
All right. So why don't we start off? Let's actually ask Grover Furr if you would unmute and ask your question. Grover? Let's see. Whoops. Ooh, it looks like he got dropped.
I'll come back.
Okay. They'll come back. Okay, Raj, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, so thank you very much, Ranjit. It really clarified for me the how the state is acting very undemocratically. So one clarification is, I think ICJ ruling for all practical purposes has said there is a genocide, but they call it a plausible case. And I think you meant it that way. But the conditions of asking to report, etc., basically cannot be fulfilled without stopping it. So in effect, you're right about that. Just so that people don't attack you, I just wanted to bring that up. Technically, it's only a plausible case. Now, my question to you is, in the United States, there's actually freedom of expression in the Constitution. I think it's the Second Amendment, if I'm not mistaken. So, but in Britain, there's actually not a constitution. It's based on traditions, right? Britain doesn't have a formal constitution. So how are your rights protected? And why it seems like a state can be more oppressive in England than even the United States, which is the preeminent imperialist power in the world today. So that is my question to you to begin with.
Thanks, Raj. Well, I'm not an expert on constitutional law. We don't have a constitution. You're right. We have a system of legal precedent, which is, so we have even older established legal system and customs based on kind of Anglo-Saxon common law with some Roman law welded to it. But we do have, still human rights law, which is from the European Court of Human Justice, which does apply to us. And even though we've separated in Brexit from that, those things do apply to us. So we do have guarantees of free speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of thought. But then, of course, what any lawyer or politician will say to you is that the freedom of speech operates within certain limits. And when your rights infringe on others' rights, then there should be natural limits to that. And that's reasonable, isn't it? But what's not reasonable is when you essentially are campaigning against a genocide. I certainly call it a genocide, irrespective of the ICJ. But my interpretation, I totally take your point, is that they've awarded provisional measures short of a ceasefire. But that essentially they said that's because they can't order a ceasefire because Hamas is not a party to the court. So, I mean, essentially they've done that. It's a pretty strong verdict, a stronger verdict than I was expecting, and a stronger case, and actually a more emotional case than I was expecting. And I think it was very compelling. I would certainly argue, irrespective of that, there is a genocide going on. That certainly, if you look at weapons companies from our country who are exporting arms to Israel, and our state giving direct support to Israel, there have been campaigners campaign against the arms trade, Palestine Palestine Action, the two groups who have been taking direct action against weapons, even to the point of, going into Raytheon factories and sabotaging the equipment. Their defense has been they are preventing the commissioning of a crime. And then they give the evidence of the genocide and the crimes committed by the Israeli Defense Force against the Palestinians as evidence. And in fact, they've been acquitted on several cases, both in past conflicts and this one. So we do have the right to criticize genocide. And the case that they put up legally is extremely flimsy, and I'd be very surprised if they took us to court. But the point is not just that they have put forward a flimsy case, it's just the very act of arrest, the very act of therefore being able to intrude into your life in various ways is extremely suppressive. And if they can obviously target people who are relatively vocal and cow them, my bail conditions from the second arrest was literally can't attend any demonstration of any kind. So clearly, if the Zionists thought I was effective, they were offended by the knowledge that we're giving out. They don't like our presence and the educational effect that we're going to have on the movement, which takes it to another level and exposes Israel. They've targeted us for a reason. And then that target becomes effective through the aegis of state power because it's an abuse of state power. It is political policing. It's political policing masquerading as criminal policing because they're saying they're protecting the rights of a minority against racism. But we're very clear this is not any kind of attack on any race or religion. This is attack upon a state and the acts commissioned by a state, which have, to me, are unquestionably genocidal acts. These are war crimes. These are internationally punishable war crimes. And our own government, of course, are complicit in carrying out those crimes, and they're making our state complicit by persecuting those who speak out against those crimes. They're making the state complicit in those crimes as well. So, and what you see is increasingly this helps to show the domestic population, the domestic campaigners, who is really responsible. So as a political device, it's what Mao would say is lifting a rock to drop it on your own feet. It's counterproductive ultimately. So there's inconvenience. They're not torturing me in jail. They're not treating me like the Israelis treat the Palestinians. They're not blindfolding me and shooting me. They're not shooting me in the street as I walk around. So let's not kind of overblow it as I'm being terribly repressed. It is repressive. And it's the prevention of people from exercising democratic rights and free speech. And it's designed to do so. And it shows the extent to which our own governments are the real agents of those crimes. They have different rule book they play, but when they go to a country where they've deprived the workers of rights and a high standard of life, life is cheap. They pretend it isn't, but they've made life cheap in those countries, and they are far more repressive abroad than here. But it's an international spread of the penetration of finance capital that allows them to adopt the national states of many countries and use them. And it's the same machine. So in a sense, it's the same repressive apparatus we're fighting under very different conditions. I don't know if that really answered your question, Raj. that's
It
my
did,
thoughts.
and I'll come up with later, but somebody asked, what is it? And I also didn't write down, what's the title of this book that got you arrested?
So that was this was Zionism. So I did say at the beginning, Zionism. It's a racist, anti-Semitic, and reactionary tool of imperialism, which I guess is a bit of a mouthful, but it's meant to encompass in the front cover, essentially, our opinion of what Zionism stands for as an ideology. It's available on our website, which is thecommunists.org, with a lot of other literature, including literature from Grover Firth. I saw it, and Ranjeet Brar, who was going to be on your show next week. So Ranjeet wrote this book on Trotskyism or Leninism. I've got Grover, your book here. So Grover's an old friend that I've met many times. So it's good to see you, Grover.
We'll promote your book, so you will have some sense.
Actually, if you would drop a link to it, not you, Ranjeet, but one of the planning committee members, please drop a link in the chat. Grover, sorry for the glitch before. Yeah, sure. That was a problem on our side. So go ahead.
Okay, well, first sound. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Because I'm using an external microphone here. Okay. Hi, Ranjeet. It seems like a long time since we've gotten together, but it's great to see you, even under these difficult circumstances, at least difficult for you. I have a couple of, really one question, but it goes into a few different parts. Some years ago, there was a pretty good book published here by Mearsheimer and Walt called The Israeli Lobby. And so at some point, I'd like you to comment on whether or not that is in part responsible, if that's operating in Great Britain too, because it's true that the police reaction, certainly the politicians' reactions, and in general the capitalist states' reactions to criticisms and attacks on Israel are very, very different from from other kinds of protests. I also wanted to ask if you have Jewish groups in the UK, like Jewish Voice for Peace, groups like that that give the lie to, or other groups that give the lie to the argument that opposition to Israel, opposition to Zionism is anti-Semitic, which is the IHRA definition, right? And then thirdly, how are we going to get your books here? Because the shipping costs are prohibitive from the UK to the United States. I wonder if they're available in PDF form or something like that.
Thanks, Grover. Lovely to speak to you. And yes, so yes, I agree with you. Israeli lobby absolutely exists, and it's kind of like a two-way machine, isn't it? So, I mean, there's this kind of theory you have to be wary of, I think, which is, the tail wags the dog theory, that Israel is so powerful that actually it's Israel that's in charge of everything. And then if you seep into that, you do suddenly find yourself in that anti-Semitic territory where it's Jews who are running the world. And actually, they came for Corbyn with that. When Corbyn even gave the vague anti-capitalist argument, he was pictured once with a cartoon, which was criticizing bankers who were playing chessboard on the world. And he said, "Oh, it's not about capital controlling the world; it's about Jews controlling the world." So, the capitalists have found very good ways of indemnifying themselves using our rules. They hide behind greenwashing and showing liberalism, meaning social liberalism, and tolerance is their policy. And they're anti-imperialist. Then when they fight Russia, they're doing it because Russia's imperialist and is oppressing people. When they invade Iraq, they're doing it to protect human rights and justice and peace and girls' education in Afghanistan. So they indemnify themselves from criticizing by saying criticizing them is racist, which it isn't. Okay, so I don't think Israel is in charge of Britain, but there is a strong interrelation between the two. I think Britain and America are very much the controlling powers who have many ways of carving up and controlling their colonies. Israel is one important and expedient way that at a certain point they will discard. I mean, the CIA gave that report, didn't they, back in 2009, in which I don't know if they were meant to leak it out, but it was leaked, in which they predicted that within 20 years Israel would no longer exist because of its enmity with its neighbors, because the neighbors are growing stronger and Israel is not growing relatively stronger, that it's likely to cease to exist. And so imperialism has no permanent allies, only permanent interests. It wants to maintain the system of exploitation. It will use different people at different times, but Israel has been a stable friend, essentially a European settler colonial state that it's used, for 100 years. And they do have strong relationships and strong political relationships. And it's certainly become a mantra of all politicians, Democratic and Republican in the United States, and now increasingly Labour and Tory in our country, that you have to support Israel, because essentially what you're doing when you say you support Israel is you're saying, I support imperialism, I support the financiers, I support the bankers, I support the arms manufacturers, I support the oil conglomerates, I support the looting of the world, because that's where the wealth comes from. It's the same reason that Tony Blair, before getting elected, had to go and meet Rupert Murdoch and the people in the City of London. You don't get elected without the blessing of finance capital, because ultimately they control the electoral process, both in our country and yours. So Israel lobby is strong. I think it's a subordinate part of the general imperialist state, not the dominant one, is a kind of short answer. In terms of, yes, we do have very many secular and religious voices. So people who are Jewish and liberal Jews, or either actually very Orthodox Jews, who regularly demonstrate, and that is particular churches and the Orthodox Jews in particular from London come onto the streets. And then there are organizations, Jews for Justice for Palestine, Jews for Peace, Jewish Friends of Palestine. There are several. And in terms of the books, yes, I think at some stage we should have a distributor in America. We should ship out some en masse. But most of the books we're trying to publish in PDF form. And if you go to the website and look for this book, you can download a PDF for free if you want. I mean, this one it's almost gone out of print, and we're going to have to reprint it anyway. But there's lots of books there. We are increasingly trying to get to the stage that you can have the PDF for free. And if you want a copy, you can buy it, because we're much more interested in disseminating knowledge than we are in making money. The books go for cost price, but you're right, the shipping can be prohibitive between continents. And thank you so much for your questions, and lovely to speak to you, Grover.
Right, thank you very
Okay,
much.
Next is Sharon, followed by Mehmet. So Sharon, if you would lower your hand. And by the way, if you have questions or comments, don't be shy. Go down to the reactions button, raise your hand. This is your opportunity. So Sharon, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for mentioning the tail wagging the dog approach that's so dangerous. There are otherwise well-meaning people here who have that position. And I think they have a website called If Americans Only Knew or something like that, where according to them, the Zionist lobby controls everything. And that's just a very dangerous position. But I wanted to ask a question, a different kind of question. The analogy between South African apartheid and Israeli apartheid. So I'm trying to figure, what I don't understand is in South Africa, the ruling class woke up and figured out that if they wanted to continue to exploit the entire South African working class, including the Black part of that working class, then they had to change the political system and they had to get rid of apartheid, and they did. And the Zionist ruling class apparently doesn't think they need the Palestinian workers, although their past practice has been that they've had a lot of people from Gaza going to work inside of the green, what we used to call the green line Israel. I think it's now called '48, but and from the West Bank as well, workers coming into Israel to do construction work and other things, but they still import a lot of people from Thailand and the Philippines and other places, and they don't appear to think that they need the Palestinian working class or that they should make any accommodation. And so the history, the trajectory of the future of Israeli apartheid doesn't seem to have any analogy with what happened in South Africa. I just was wondering if you could comment on that.
Right, thanks, Sharon. No, I wouldn't say that they were the same in any way. So they're very different countries with different histories and different economies, but both are colonial outposts, right? So the apartheid system evolved out of British colonialism, which was an apartheid system. People don't think of British colonialism for some reason as being apartheid, but if you go to India, where my father came from, you know, and the way British ruled there, they had their own enclaves because they were a tiny minority in a huge populous nation. You know, most peasants in India, as my dad said, you wouldn't be aware. You know, he grew up in British India basically for a few years pre-war. You wouldn't be able, you would never meet an English person. You wouldn't meet the ruling class. You know, there were layers in which they were run by domestic, you know, structures that were suborned to the British interest. And so they'd lived in apartheid places surrounded by retinues of servants. They lived behind the lines, it was called. But essentially that was apartheid, white only, European only, colonial only areas, colonial club, the British club, into which, you know, only white men were allowed unless you were serving the drinks, right? But that was their social code, and they've taken that social code everywhere all around the world, including to the United States. That's where it comes from. So that's racism is the ideology of European settler colonialism, and it manifests in different ways in different places depending on the specific circumstances. And so, no, they're totally different. And South Africa has a large Black population, and they were the slave labor, essentially. You know, and the white working class were a privileged layer of labor, and administrators, and then on top of that were the real ruling class in terms of the large wealthy landowners, etc. Israel's a very different situation. It's been a tool to divide and rule. It's more what we call, you know, we always say it's like an unsinkable aircraft carrier. It lives on a lot of subsidies, doesn't it, from Britain and the United States in terms of the billions they pump into it, the billions of weapons and billions of economic subsidies. They've built it up industrially. It does have, surprisingly, high-tech industries in some fields, particularly weapons and tech industries, but it also is used as a means to penetrate and dominate both militarily and economically the wider Middle East. And it's used as a large, you know, friendly population to the interests of Anglo-American imperialism, whose interests are totally aligned. But it does have an apartheid state in terms of both within Israel, the different rights of the Arab and Jewish population, They're totally different rights and totally different way you can be treated, even if you, are an Arab Israeli and carry that passport. And equally, obviously, if you're a Palestinian and you see the way the West Bank is subdivided, if you see obviously the occupation and the genocide happening in Gaza now, it's quite clear that the colonial racism, which is a European racism, not Jewish racism, it's a European settler colonial project, and it carries that racism. So if you see some of the TikToks and the racists, they're dressing up in blackface, basically pretending to be Arabs, mocking their poverty. They've got black teeth and one eyebrow, and so mocking their poverty, the situation they've been put in economically, and mocking their racial characteristics and their names, saying they're inferior human beings, saying it's okay to shoot them. So this is analogous in a way. It's a more virulent racism, even than the whites had. And if you look at the whites in South Africa, they would say, "Oh, we're separate, but no, we're equal but separate. We're different but different but equal. Separate. We have to live separate lives, but we're not again. But they would not go around needlessly killing everyone. They would repress the freedom fighters, but otherwise they kind of respect them. But it's a more of an expansionist project, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit like the Nazis when they expanded into the Soviet Union. The biggest genocide was against the Slavic people. Like if they killed 27 million, only about 10 million of those were Red Army. The army exchanges were pretty equal, but they had regular genocide against the population, and not just the Jews, the Slavs, because they had a program that they would have a German settler population that they would set up, and these kind of gradually displace them, and we could work them to death in the process. And if you look at Eretz Israel, what does the flag of Israel represent? It's the Jewish state between the two rivers, those being the Euphrates and the Nile. They still have ambition, and the Smotrich and the Ben Gvirs of the cabinet are very open about it. They want to take over the Middle East, push out the Arabic population, and implant wider and wider Jewish settler populations. Why they celebrate settling, and they're talking openly about settling Gaza, displace Gaza, have the genocide in Gaza. They've sold the land to developers, and they've made plans for taking the oil, the gas offshore. So it's very clear they want the land, they want the resources, they want to expand. That's what they see their role as. Now, you could say it's going nowhere, and they're mad, and they're on a path to self-destruction, and that's true. And the same is true of capitalism generally. But that is an ideology that they suffer, that they adhere to, not that I adhere to. And you're right. I think historically it is going nowhere, and it's on a path to self-destruction. And if there was a chance for a two-state solution during Arafat's time, I really think on their current path, the current leadership and the current climate in Israeli society, I don't think there is that chance. And I think, sooner or later, there's likely to be a one-state solution. And exactly who is left in Israel and how, or Palestine, and how that comes about, will be a process that we'll see unfold historically. But you're right. I do think it's the policy of supremacy is past its sell-by date, which is precisely why the project is failing. And I don't think they can exterminate the resistance, but they're lighting a fire under themselves, essentially, with their terrible crimes.
Okay, next is Mehmet. If you would unmute yourself, followed by Yusuf. Then I have a question. I'll jump in, but raise your hand if you have any questions. Go down the reactions button. So Mehmet, please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. It was a very good presentation. Thank you for that. I want to just make a point first and then ask you a question. It looks like imperialism and colonialism makes strange bedfellows. There has been a tremendous change in Turkey that used to support, without questions, the Palestinians. But in my last trip a few months ago, I noticed that those people who are very strong anti-Semitists are now actually an enemy of the Palestinians. It's very interesting that, the major supporter of Palestinians have become an enemy because of the wars and the influx of the mostly Syrian and Iraqi refugees to Turkey. It has brought up the old racism against the Arabs in 1923 when Turkey was formed. This racism was installed top down to the people, and this started to come up. And it's very interesting that people just don't even want to hear the word Palestine, one of the reasons is that Erdogan, who's hated in the country mostly from the intellectuals and, you know, those people, they associate Palestine with Erdogan, who is a fascist and is a Sharia, you know, he wants to bring Sharia and so on and so forth. So unfortunately, Palestinian issue in Turkey is now goes together with anti-Semitism and Sharia. So that's a very interesting point that's coming up. I'd like to ask you a question. After you were arrested and harassed this much, are you thinking about maybe bringing a suit or a court, case against this? Because it looks like they were really, yes, they were targeting you on not such of a strong basis. I wonder if you are thinking about that, which will serve as an example to others that they may be harassing in the future. Thank you very much again for the presentation.
Thanks, Mehmet, so much. So I'm on your first point. Yeah, I think we see interesting, sometimes strange political bedfellows on the same side of history. So I think you have to differentiate between sometimes people's the ideological justification that people have and the content of their action. There are lots of religious groups who are fundamentally fighting very strongly anti-imperialist fights without what I would consider to be the correct guidance of a Marxist ideology, and nonetheless they're identifying the enemy and fighting them effectively. And sometimes, and that's been an interesting thing about the movement here as well. So people who reached out to me after my arrest have come from many different spectrums, including the really quite religious or quite conservative, or people who would have different political viewpoint to my own, but they all can see the justice of this cause. So it is interesting sometimes when you get a broad movement, you have to learn to rub along and what I would identify as the broad working class interest, but not everyone sees it in that light. But nevertheless, they see the justice of that cause, and it's an opportunity to work with people and try and educate them. Politics is complex like that. In terms of the repression, yes, it is repression. Yes, the cases are flimsy. I have to get to the point where I've successfully got rid of the state's prosecution against me, and then it'll be possible, I'm sure, to have a counteraction against them. Yeah, I intend to do that.
Okay, next is Yusuf. If you would unmute yourself and ask your question. Others, raise your hand if you have any questions.
Okay, for Ranjeet, was a book, Zionism in the Age of the Dictators by Lenny Brenner, which I think was very good. And actually, it was printed in England in 1983, if you're aware of it. Then that's just a short comment. May I answer a response to Sharon? In response to Sharon, I would say that the apartheid, and maybe Ranjit could elaborate on this further, the apartheid faction in Israel are the liberal Zionists who would see the Palestinian people as a source of cheap labor. But what's here are the expulsionists and exterminationists in power right now. The apartheid faction is the liberal faction, it's so-called liberal faction. In response to Mehmet, I'm Turkish as well. Although I've not been in Turkey recently, I contact people via Zoom and so on and so forth. I think what Mehmet describes are the secular nationalists, found among the secular nationalists, not among certainly not among the socialists, not in the leading people, the vocal people in the socialist left. And the secular nationalists are sort of encroach a little bit on the left and also on the right. But I don't think it's a visible, very overall politically. The Turkish parliament voted overwhelmingly to support condemn Israel. Of course, Erdogan. Trade increased after October 7th, as is vitriol against while his vitriol was increasing. Okay.
Okay. Actually, I think Ranjeet got dropped and then is back in. Raj, if you would make him co-host.
I'm
Okay.
so sorry about that. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah. I have a question, then we'll go to Richard and then Janet. This is kind of broadening out from the topic of the repression against Palestinian solidarity activists, but can you just say a little bit about the resistance to this campaign, the October 7th Al-Aqsa flood, and the impact of that on kind of the international scene, and in particular, the struggle of oppressed peoples and the working class throughout the world. Some people are saying that, well, this is just a terrible tragedy and it's very, it's very heartfelt. But can you speak a little bit to how this is affecting the historical stage right now?
I have to be a bit careful because actually you say it's a diversion, but actually it goes to the heart of the second arrest, because the second arrest, it was specifically for that, using that phrase that we were told that we were speaking in support of Hamas. So whilst the leaflet generally is an old leaflet and one which has justified the right of an occupied people to resist and the Palestinian people to right to resist and calls for victory to that resistance, victory of that just struggle. We want the Palestinian people to win. People have different ideas of what winning looks like in the struggle. But it particularly mentions in the first paragraph of that leaflet, that the Operation Al-Aqsa flood on October the 7th has sparked a new wave in the history of resistance. And now is the time to reaffirm that we still wish the resistance to triumph. And this, of course, is referring to the fact that it's a far larger historical struggle. We're encouraged to look at this current wave of struggle and look at it in isolation. Like there was an initial crime that happened against Israel on October the 7th, and almost anything is justified in response, because as the Zionists say, and as our press parrot, this is the largest, attack upon Jews since the Holocaust. Right? So it's a huge, this is the way they frame it. And as this terrible crime has happened, then Israel's reaction is self-defense. And in fact, this has nothing to do with Palestine. This is just Hamas, and it's Israel-Hamas. And our press, I don't know about yours, refers to it as the Israel-Hamas war. But hang on, Hamas was formed in 1987, and Palestine is a historic entity which goes back a long time. And there's the Balfour Declaration was signed in 1919, and even before then, the Zionist movement had started their colonization or their movement to Palestine. So this is a historic struggle that was adopted by British imperialism. So to talk about this struggle goes to the heart of the struggle for the liberation of the Arab masses. And if for example, if I look at the very first, paragraph on the preamble of this book, on the back cover, it says, "The Zionist state of Israel is a dagger aimed at the heart of the Arab people's revolutionary democratic movement. At the same time, it is subjugating mentally a large proportion of the world's Jews, people who are formerly to be found in the front ranks of every democratic and socialist movement. It's not a Jewish project, it's an imperialist construct, an instrument to perpetuate imperialist domination of the Middle East. Its main purpose is to ensure continued imperialist control of the region's oil and gas reserves." So this is what we see. We can see an ongoing struggle. If we look at around Israel, Israel's neighbors, its dispute with Syria and the Golan Heights. Well, Syria is under occupation, and currently, through the waves of the destabilization since 2011, we've currently reached the situation where a third of Syria, the oil-rich area, remains under occupation of US troops. Iraq, since the Iraq War, remains essentially under a form of US occupation. Yes, there's another government. That government's even asking US to leave currently, but there are large bases and occupation forces all over Iraq. Afghanistan had large bases and occupation forces all over it until very recently. And so we get this ongoing pattern of armies of domination and political regimes in Saudi Arabia and Egypt set up to maintain the financial interests of US imperialism. And there are periods when that all looks very stable. But you never know with these, very deep conflicts of interest between the domestic population and imperialism, between workers and a small comprador capitalist elite who go along with that, what it is that's going to light the struggle. So unquestionably, this current wave of resistance has led to a much more united struggle. All of those different struggles seem to be coming together into one. The Yemenis, we've been looking at the terrible, genocidal war that's been fought by the Saudis as a proxy force of Britain and America, with British and American weapons that have caused the deaths of hundreds of thousands through starvation and cholera and dysentery and war. And all of these are coming to be one united struggle almost of the Middle Eastern peoples trying to reclaim their right to a peaceful, decent life, to benefit from their own resources. This should be one of the richest areas on earth, but of course that wealth is siphoned off via our own companies. So it's unquestionably that the Palestinian struggle has been central to the Arab people's vision of their own injustice and central to their narrative of liberation from imperialism. And certainly this exposure of Israel, this failure, therefore, of Israel to be able to normalize its diplomatic relations with other nations, the anger of the mass of Arab people who want to throw off their domination and achieve better life based on their own wealth. I think this is a movement which is having resurgence. But of course, politically, it's more complex because the forces that are waging those battles are different, with different ideologies and beliefs. And yet, for all that, they are learning to find ways to work together on their common interest. And what's uniting them really is their hostility to American and British imperialism and their regional proxies.
Okay, next, Richard, if you would unmute and ask your question. Richard Wright.
Yeah. All my questions were preempted by a couple of commenters. So anyway, one thing, a quick comment. As long as you're going to put it out, you put your book out as a PDF, you might consider publishing it as a EPUB as well. And the reason is because EPUBs, you can take notes and highlight things and that kind of stuff. That's a technical thing. I guess the question I had is regarding this arrest. Is this something that you think is unique to the current government? One, and two, they've banned you from distributing stuff or during marches. Do you do anything like on a house-to-house basis? And would that be prohibited? And two, I'd like to, I think somebody else mentioned doing a civil action. Is there any way that you could do a civil action against the officers? Anyways, I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Richard. Yeah, I think so. Civil action, I think we will do. I think you do it against the Metropolitan Police in general rather than the individual officers. But I'm not sure about taking action against the individual officers. I'm not sure if that's an option. In terms of distributing material, it carries on. It's only me, that can't go to, and some of the other arrested comrades that can't go to demonstrations. We still do have a presence on the demonstrations. We are finding that a stationary stall is targeted by the Zionist spotters. We're getting better at monitoring. We know which websites they literally, post, on Twitter at the Metropolitan Police, and the Metropolitan Police have people obviously at the demonstration who live in real time are responding to their direction of where to go. So we're actually getting better at having people who are going to monitor them. We're going to actually assign people to follow them and highlight their activity, highlight this link. I think the British people will find this deeply sinister and against what they consider to be the rules of their country, to see this level of political policing. And so I think we need to organize exposure of the people who are facilitating and directing that political policing. That's instructive. It's not unique to this government because they've had anti-terror legislation for a long time. They have banned and proscribed groups who they have been aiming at. They have never needed to single us out because we're a relatively small group. But I think in the current climate, they're very worried about the size and force of that demonstration. 1 million people on the streets is very difficult to control. They can't. They assemble a lot of police to concentrate against them, and they would like to, if there was a smaller demonstration, they'd have a conflict with the police, have some demonstration, have a battle, beat a few people, be able to show that as a spectacle to the whole country and say they're violent people, get everyone to condemn them, and in that way get rid of the marches. But they've been too big to attack in that way. And so they've adopted a different strategy, which is to try and pick off the activists from around the edge, loud people, make an example of them. And if they're able then, one, to stop their influence and stop that education reaching the masses, but also just to intimidate more and more of the marchers, they hope to get them to be, basically gradually get them off the street. The other thing they do, of course, is they suborn the leadership. So if you see the main organizations who actually call the march, they're people like Palestine Solidarity Campaign, Stop the War, and a CND, Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. All of these organizations essentially are kind of dominated by the Labour Party, and the Labour Party is a party of imperialism. So that's why one of our other books that we're very keen to publicize, and there's a talk that I've given to introduce this book. It's for our country, it's very important for British workers to understand that the people that they think of as being the party of Labour are in fact a party of the enemies of the capitalist class, and that they are going to need to go the hard route of developing a party that really represents them, which to us has to be a Marxist party. We obviously put ourselves forward in that role. We're currently small and can't fulfill that role, but it's through growth in this times of mass movement and education that we are hoping to grow and adopt that really vibrant ability to affect the politics and ultimately the policy of our country. We want to stop our country being the problem in the world and make it part of the solution.
Okay, Janet, please unmute and ask your question, Janet.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Ranjeet, first for speaking out about the situation in occupied Palestine and for your presentation today. I just have a few comments. First, about what you said about Israel, that it is a British, or was a British idea initially. The Zionists learned their repressive military skills from the British, who had centuries of experience during its colonial period, and that it brought to Palestine during the British Mandate of Palestine. Also, Yusuf mentioned Lenny Brenner's book, Zionism in the Age of the Dictators. I posted something to the chat about the cover of that book. It's, I don't know if you can see it.
Yes, I see it. Thank you. Yes.
And
that was the coin that was minted to celebrate the Havara, wasn't it, by the SS?
It was actually a medal, yeah.
That's it,
And in the chat, I described it. I can say what is on inside the book about that. Quote, when Hitler came to power, sorry, the German Zionist Federation, ZVFD, believed that its doctrine that Germany wasn't the homeland of its Jews would lead to Nazi support for Zionism. The ZVFD organized a 6-month visit to Palestine for SS officer Leopold von Mildenstein. Der Angriff, the assault, the leading Nazi propaganda organ, ran von Mildenstein's pro-Zionist report in 1934. To commemorate the Baron's expedition, propaganda minister Joseph Goebbels had a medal struck. On one side, the Zionist star, on the other, the Nazi swastika. So I just wanted to mention that. And then finally, the silencing of speech in the West is not just about Israel-Palestine. In the US, you're probably familiar with the indictment of the Uhuru Three, who are affiliated with the African People's Socialist Party, as being Russian agents because of their position on Ukraine. It's just getting worse and worse, the silencing of speech. I'll stop there.
Janet, thank you. That was very powerful. And yes, and it does cover, the book does cover that. And you can see, I think that's chapter 5. It deals with the collaboration and it mentions precisely those names, those figures, those coins, and the direct collaboration there was, amazingly, it seems to those who don't know the history, between the victims of Nazism and the Nazis, the SS themselves, who saw this as a means, as you say, of clearing Jews out of Europe, and actually also, interestingly, a way of stopping the boycott, because American Jewry in particular was economically very powerful. And if you've read, for example, or what's the book, IBM and the Holocaust? Have you read or heard of that book? It's quite an interesting book about the development of IBM and the way in which it collaborated with the Nazi Germans, and how they designed machines, essentially the Hollerith machine, the forerunner of the computer, which was instrumental to organizing the population census that allowed the Nazis to find those people of Jewish extraction and Jewish religion whom they later targeted. And the fact that it was an American company, that they were their biggest company, biggest trade partner. And in fact, this was a time when the world was calling for sanctions against the excesses of the rise of Nazism. And the fact of the collaboration of the Zionists was used as an argument against imposing sanctions on the business of Nazi Germany in the pre-war period, and that was actually quite central, and that came up in the fascist movement in Britain. The black shirts here, so our fascist movement, it was led by a chap called Mosley, who had initially been the Labour Party and then formed the fascist party here. Printed directly that how can they tell us to have sanctions on Nazi Germany when the Jews themselves are not having sanctions? And he pointed to the Zionist movement and their Havara deal as being a reason. So that's very interesting. And yes, you're quite right. I think the repressive methods have been learned well from Britain. And that coin, was, as you say, it just illustrates that juxtaposition, and that these are obviously not our inventions. This is historical truth, and so therefore, to our strong point is to refer to historical truth. Cannot be a criminal offence, but it really gets to the point where the propaganda, the mainstream narrative, becomes so far divorced from the historical reality that they find, I think, very threatening. And I think the reason we've been targeted is precisely our desire, our conviction, and our knowledge of that historical truth, our ability to put that in a way that can be digested by the British public at a time when they're becoming ready for it. And it is threatening to our state, I think. So thank you, Janet, for your question and contribution.
Raj, go ahead.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So in '67 war, I was a graduate student at University of Illinois in Champaign-Urbana, which is not a very big town. It's two towns with a common border. And my professor was who taught me about concrete design was a Jewish professor, and he told us after the war started that they had raised right in that town $26,000, which in today's dollar terms would be something over $250,000. And there was genuine sense of fear of the Holocaust, which at that time informed a lot of Jewish people who were not necessarily Zionist, but they kind of saw Israel as last bastion of their defense, because they also feared the Christians here. In fact, my clients and my firms I work for, they had also fear of Christians here because the Jews were discriminated in the United States too by the Christians. That's the whole thing. But somewhere here, over these many years, with all Israel is doing, and particularly after this incident, when they're actually committing what definitely appears to be a genocide, at least the intent and the intensity of attack, the things are changing. And that's why it seems to me the imperial ruling classes are trying to block any kind of movement towards disaffection of the workers from that. And so here I agree with you that the imperialism is, I gather from you, and I agree with you that it is the weak state, and you can see power shifting from the G7 over to the East, which is BRICS, in terms of economic power. So there's a desperation now to try to control it. And why do you think the working class, both in England and elsewhere, United States, is not moving towards communist parties? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes, but it's very difficult to speak to. You're a very knowledgeable group with very deep and searching questions. But I'll try and be brief and give you my thoughts on it. So the Communist Party themselves are very weak, right? Our party is 20 years old, but the communist movement itself, which was very strong in terms of the Third International, has been decimated by Khrushchevite revisionism, Sino-Soviet split, the period of collapse of the Soviet Union, Eastern Bloc countries, in which Chancellor Kohl was able to hold up a copy of imperialism and a copy of capital and say, this is finished, communism is over, end of history, Francis Fukuyama. So there's still that ideological triumph of the defeat of communism, despite the survival of communist states. Those communist states also operate quite a market system and have had to integrate to an extent into the capitalist system. So there's a lot of dogma about them as well, that they're not really communist. And you're going to discuss that next time. So there's the weakening of the communist movement in general, and imperialism got an economic shot in the arm from the collapse of the Soviet Union. It looted the wealth of the Soviet states at a time when it was in actually quite a profound crisis. So it had a boost in power, and then we got the unipolar order when the United States, with the rest of the imperialists under their coattails, have been fighting a period of colonial war. Stalin famously said, if the Soviet Union collapsed, an era of the blackest reaction would set in. And I would argue we've seen precisely what he said. He obviously didn't anticipate that it was going to collapse. I've got surgeons I learned surgery from who were, maybe 30 years older than me, who went to school in the 50s and the 60s, university, and they would tell me, suddenly surprised me because they're right-wing Tories and they were scrubbing up for an operation. They suddenly turned to me and say, "Of course, in my day," and this is before they knew I was political. In my day, there was class consciousness. Oh, where's this going? and it would tell me they just assumed that the capitalist world would fall, and socialism was on a triumphal kind of path that it would spread to the whole world, and they weren't opposed to it. They were basically in favor of it. That was the general assumption. Now, ideologically, it's had a massive smash. Economically, it's had a massive smash, and it's taken this period of colonial war to reestablish, people's basic understanding of their own state. In America, there's the dogma that America is the good guy. It doesn't matter what movie you see. The propaganda machine is very strong, and that's reproduced on a slightly more serious scale in mainstream historiography, education, everywhere you go. So the ideological and propaganda strength and cultural strength of Anglo-American imperialism has been ascendant in the globe for a long time. So you're going against that. You're going against the myth of what communism is supposed to be, the boogeyman. So there's that. And then there is, just the question of the fact that imperialism still economically is able to bribe its own working class with relatively good paying conditions so that we can actually have good lives. So despite whatever little bit of repression I'm coming under, I have a good life. I have a house and a wife and a family and kids, and I go to the swimming pool and I can go to the gym and I eat well and I'm not hungry, So life is not yet pushing the working people classically in the imperialist countries into that kind of action. As it presses them, they're getting more angry because, partly it's that their life expectations, what they expect they should be able to achieve, and what they can actually achieve, no longer coincide. They're poorer than the generation before them. They're getting angrier, and there is a genuine section, even in our own countries, who are really poor. I saw some footage from Oakland, California, just yesterday or the day before. Genuine poverty in the streets, right? There's no shortage of homelessness and the number of people without Medicare and all the rest. So there is discontent growing in the world. Of course, there's far more militancy and far more repression. So it's a different balance. But there's unquestionably the case that overall the imperialist system is weakening, and the militancy of the masses is rising. And you don't know always the straw that breaks the camel back. The Ukraine war has been very pivotal in the steepening of the fall of the system, the fall of NATO, and this second war in the Middle East. And there have been also a wave of revolutions across the Sahel. So all around the world, people are taking the opportunity to break free. And as they do so, economically, it will weaken our own imperialist powers, and it will bring back a period of greater hardship, but a possibility of opening, a far more profound chapter of freedom struggle, which will ultimately lead to a far better and more equal society. So I just think we're in that process, which from the individual seems like it's long and hopeless, but actually from a historical perspective, it's a blip, actually, and we're still in that same process of seeing the demise of imperialism.
We're going to have you back to speak on this subject in a separate session. I think Raj snuck that in, but we'll have you back for a full session. Next is Jackie. So go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question, Jackie. Jackie, are you there?
Yeah, the phone is muted.
Okay. All right. So I'm going to ask you just to wrap up here, Ranjeet, if you could comment a little bit about there've been some very large demonstrations here in the Bay Area in San Francisco. Very heartening to see young people coming out, all different nationalities, a very mass issue. It's the kind of movement that we haven't really seen here, well, since the Iraq War, but even reminds me of the anti-Vietnam War movement from 50 years ago. I was going to ask you as the last question, just to sum up, what do you see the role of conscious kind of anti-imperialist and communists in this movement in terms of sort of how people's sentiments and the energy can be expanded and directed towards anti-imperialism and socialism? So if you, maybe that'll be your last comment for today.
Thanks so much. Well, I think we've got a crucial role to play, and I think that's actually why we are being targeted. In our own country, they've suddenly rehabilitated a group of Trotskyites called the IMT, and they've rebranded themselves. Our website is thecommunists.org. They've rebranded themselves as the Revolutionary Communist Party, like Bob Avakian's party, and their website is now the Communist, so the same, but without an s.org. And they're pushing quite confusing, essentially bourgeois propaganda with a revolutionary coating. In a time of universal renegacy, the truth itself is a revolutionary act. And I think, having the information, which is relevant to the concerns of the people who are engaged in this struggle, and being able to push them from their understanding, because what they're seeing, and I think what's different is, in a way, people have lost faith in the mainstream narrative of politicians and the mainstream media. That in itself is a huge victory for us. They haven't yet found the truth, but they lost faith in the sanctity of the lies of our bourgeois establishment. The credibility of our prime ministers and opposition figures at an all-time low. People's lives are getting harder. They want the truth. The truth is really revolutionary. It's dangerous. It is dangerous. They've proved by their actions. They don't want me to give out books. They don't want me to give out pamphlets. They don't want me to speak to people on demonstrations. They don't want me to attend demonstrations. They don't want people who are conscious and strong and have the ability to make common cause and inspire and educate the masses to be among the masses when the masses are on the move. They fear it. We've got a great deal to offer. And, social media there are some very negative things about it. As my dad says, every idiot can speak to them to each other. In a way, you get kind of a low level, kind of very coarse and unpleasant discourse. But in another way, it allows you to smash through some of the bourgeois media and narrative, where they were formerly very good at controlling the picture. You just would never have known about the atrocities. But now we're getting almost live, sometimes very harrowing images on social media of the sniping of children and the atrocities and the blowing up of buildings and blowing up of hospitals, and doctors walking out of the hospital speaking to us in our own language in English and saying, this is what's happened. Al-Shifa hospital's been bombed. There were 500-700 women and children here. There are limbs in the streets, amputated limbs of the people who have been done to death by what is essentially a JDAM bomb, clearly an Israeli bomb, given to them by the US, dropped on a hospital. And those pictures come directly to people who are not political in the West, and they see them. And so they feel a connection and a shame for those crimes, which they've not felt before. And I think in that way, there are huge holes being blown in the mainstream narrative. I think our job is to find ways to put the truth in a form which is palatable. Use social media. We're very heavily repressed on social media, and yet for all that, when people look for us, they can find us, and we have ways through sometimes these attacks, sometimes through the oppression the minor forms of oppression that they put upon us. They help us to extend our message further. Our job is to educate, to bring knowledge, and to try and organize, and through that knowledge to bring, some kind of shape and form and real leadership. The working class need a leadership that really represents them. It's our job to provide that and find whatever creative way we can to bring that into being. So thank you so much for having me. It's been a real pleasure. Very deep and searching questions from a very knowledgeable audience and group of comrades. So thanks for having me.
Can you
Thank
share
you.
your contact information, your email? Maybe in the chat.
Sure, I can do that, no problem.
Oh boy, we had a couple last minute hands that were raised. Let's I think we'll wrap it up. Really appreciate the time that you took to speak to us today. I know you're very busy. We're really honored and very pleased that you came and spoke to us. People can stick around afterwards and we can discuss more about this. So thank you, Ranjeet, for participating with us today, and we'll have you back, hopefully. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'll just tell you what I've done, which is I've put my email there in the chat. I've put my website address, and that's our Twitter handle for our organization. And I'll just put that one. So if you guys are on Twitter, that's that. And I think Jyoti, I'll put Jyoti's because she's very worth following, at Jyoti to Gaza. And she's on Telegram as well, Jyoti to Gaza. So those are some last three Twitter handles. Before that, I put my email address, and most importantly, it's the website of our party. So please go there. There's loads and loads of free content. Oh, have I lost you? Yeah, there you are.
No, there you go.
Loads and loads of free content, articles, analysis, and links to books, and a lot of them are available as PDF, and we'll be able to freely download. But the cost is not prohibitive of the books and the freight. So if you do want some, please do. I'm sure you'll find some things that are interesting. And thanks for your tips. I'm going to find Lenny Brenner's book. What was it? Zionism: The Age of Dictators. So I'll definitely look that up.
Thank you, Ranjeet.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS-Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. And checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/NPML. For information, write to NPML at Marxistlibr.org, and the website is Marxistlibr.org.